Welcome to A Case of the Mondays, a podcast by 3R Strategy where we talk about some of the most pressing issues facing HR professionals and business leaders. From fair treatment of employees to fostering transparency in the workplace, we'll explore how to create an environment where people don't just have to come to work, but want to. So, if you're feeling blue, tune in and join the conversation so you don't end up with a case of the Mondays.
Welcome to another episode of A Case of the Mondays, a podcast by 3R Strategy. My name is Rameez, author of A Case of the Mondays, How to Build a Culture of Trust Through Pay Transparency. In today's episode, we're discussing the strikes that have been taking place across the UK and in France, why some of these strikes are taking place, and all topics related to inequality and cost of living. Today I'm joined by my colleagues Tracey and Sophie Lee, and before we get into the discussion, I know some of us are aware about the strikes that have been taking place here in the UK, which includes the rail strikes, the teacher strikes, the junior doctors. But Sophie, could you maybe introduce yourself and tell us a bit about the strikes that are taking place in France?
Sure, thanks, Rameez. So I've just joined 3R Strategy as a senior reward consultant. I've always worked in reward. We obviously love the topic of pay. And I do have to say this is my first ever podcast. And you would have guessed by my accent that I am French. I've been living in the UK for over 10 years. But I think the most recent strikes really, you would have heard that are about the retirement age that has just been increased in France from 62 years old to 64 years old. So I know for a lot of countries, it sounds like it would be a dream to retire at such a young age. But I think why people are protesting are obviously because of the increase in the retirement age, but also because of the way it's been done by the president. So I think the most recent strikes are not just about fighting, for their rights and the fact that in France, they don't live to work, they work to live. They've got a really, good social protection, really good public services in general. And obviously they want to fight for this. But the big problem at the moment is that, so Emmanuel Macron, the French president, chose to push the law through without a proper consultation, without a proper vote in the parliament. So we've got two houses, a little bit like the UK, and I hope I don't get this wrong. You've got your MPs, you've got the House of Lords, so it is a little bit similar. And this is what people have been fighting about. So it's not just about, their social rights. It's about fighting against the establishment, and the way that people feel they've not been listened to. And it doesn't matter anyway if they say they're against it. The government will just go ahead with it and they will find a way to do it. Some sort of loophole. So this is why people have been really, really unhappy, and protests have been non-stop. There are still protests, by the way, primarily in the public sector. And I do have to say, maybe because it's easier to strike in the public sector. And, you would have heard about the bin men, obviously rail workers, schools. Can't think of anything else, but yes, so this is about the most recent strikes. But you might have heard the past couple of years, there's been the Yellow Vest movement as well. I don't know if you've heard about this. So we've not heard lot about... Oh, you haven't? Okay, I think... If you ask me, I think it's been kept quiet by the mainstream media, but the past couple of years, you have that movement, which is also protesting against the establishment. And I think it started with the increase of the cost of petrol. And it really impacted not poor people, but poorer people who live in towns, in the countryside. They need their car to go to work. They need their car to do anything. And obviously they've been the most impacted, and they really feel that they've been left out by the government. So the context at the moment in France is really, really, really difficult in general.
So it seems like there are a lot of issues that have led to these strikes, but the key one is probably the pension and in the increase in pension age, which I guess is slightly different from the reasons, quite different from the reasons that the strikes have been taking place in the UK. What do you think, Tracey, are some of the key reasons that the strikes have been taking place in the UK?
this time round is definitely the high inflation and therefore the impact on cost of living. Although, you know, some of the strikes are about working conditions as well. We have had pension strikes in the past when we've tried to change, well, not we, the government changed pensions for the public sector. But if we're talking about most recent strikes, yeah, that is focused on mostly wanting inflationary based pay. But like I say, there are underlying working conditions for some of these strikes as well.
Okay, so let's maybe look at both of those issues separately. So let's start with pension. Mm-hmm. And I know in France there's a lot of disagreement over how Macron has pushed this legislation through without any consultation. But if you look at the idea of increasing the pension age, do you not think that makes sense in principle, because life expectancy has gone up significantly over the last few decades? And so if people are retiring at the same age, but there's these pension payments that need to be paid for an extra 20 years, where does that money come from? So do you agree that the pension age should increase, or do you think it should stay the same? And that's why you agree with the strikes.
So it's a tough question, because I feel I don't want to betray myself. I don't want to betray the people of France. If I were to say, actually, yes, it would make sense in principle to increase the retirement age, because, you know, it's an aging population, like in a lot of countries, and it needs to be funded somehow. But I really think with France it's very cultural. You know, people are very attached to, you know, all this, what I call social protection they've been having. And like I said earlier, they want that work-life balance. You know, they don't want to increase the number of years they have to work to have full pension, the full state pension. And I can understand in that aspect because it's cultural, but yeah, I do think, if I have to say, that it could make sense that perhaps the retirement age should be increased. And I suppose if I agree with the strikes, it would be that it's more about the way it's been done. Mm. You've got me here, Rameez.
Yeah. Well, I'm not trying to get you, but I have no influence over policy. But I'm just thinking, you know, all three of us are in reward. And as reward people, we think about numbers. And if you think about life expectancy going up significantly, I think even in the last 20 years, it's gone up by 6 years here in the UK. And in the last 50 years, it's gone up significantly. So the numbers just don't add up. And so there has to be a way of making some sort of adjustment. And do you think, Tracey, we should have something similar in the UK?
I think it's the cut-off point, isn't it? So if you tell me when I'm in my 20s that we're extending the retirement age by 3 years, I don't care, because I'm just not thinking about that. But if I'm in my late 50s and I'm suddenly told I'm going to have to work an extra 3 years, then that's when it becomes an issue. So I think it's the cut-off point is important, of when does it apply to you? And I don't know what the right cut-off point for that is, but I can understand we need to do something, but it's how you go about doing it that's important.
Yeah, so I see what you mean. And it makes sense, because, you know, if you're near retirement age and then suddenly you're told you have another 4 years before you can retire. But at the same time, it's virtually impossible for governments to plan 50 years in advance to say, in 50 years' time, you are going to have an increased pension retirement age, isn't it?
Well, you just say those born after this date have a retirement age of this, and those born prior to that have the original retirement date. So you don't have to wait in 50 years.
Yeah, but it will be implemented in X number of years, right? Because
yeah,
you're planning for the future. And I guess it's the nature of how our economies and governments are set up is nobody's thinking 50 years. They're thinking we're in power for 5 years, 10 years maybe, and we want to get something now rather than make improvements in 50 years.
Mm-hmm. But I think, if I may say, is that maybe people and, the newer generations, maybe they feel hard done by. Maybe they've got this impression, and it's always the case, that the previous generations had it better. It was all great. Even when you think about pensions, you had the defined benefit scheme. Everything is changing. It's everything is more difficult to find jobs for life. It's about pay increases that don't keep up with inflation, and should they, keep up with inflation? It's a whole mixture of things at the moment that, from a social perspective, social agenda, I think we're reaching a point where people have had enough. And, again, culturally speaking, in France, people will just say it. They will be blunt, they will say it, they will protest. But to see it in the UK, I think we have reached a major change,
Because I wonder if, like you say, that is a cultural thing. Because generationally, I don't think the younger generations in the UK probably would have thought about those things. I mean, trying to get them to think about pensions. I mean, how many times have you been trying to launch a pension or pushing the pension scheme in your organisation and trying to get the younger generations into that? I mean, it's so hard. But I think probably being pushed in the media and actually being talked about, maybe they are thinking about it now, but I don't think that's something that the younger generations have thought about in the past. I don't know if that's different in France.
And this is really interesting, because the most recent strikes, actually, you see young people in the crowds protesting. It's all ages. It's not just the older population, and it's everybody from public, private sector. So there is something at the moment. And if I may also say it, I think government should be worried in general.
So here's a question. Now, we have all different types of people that are protesting or striking, and you have, in France, for example, there was do I say bin men? Bin people?
Refuge workers? I don't know.
Anyway, so they're striking, and at the same time you have, for example, office workers that are striking. Now, should they all have the same retirement age? Because if you have jobs that require physical manual work, a lot of stress, should they be retiring at the age of 70, for example, the same time as somebody who's working in an office, sitting down all day, and has maybe a different type of stress, mental stress, but it's should they all have the same retirement age, or should we think about different retirement ages based on different professions?
I guess that thought process works when people had a job for life, a career for life. But if you are a refuge worker and then you decide to change your career at 40, you go and do something else, your pension that you earned at the beginning is from when you were a refuge worker. So that's when you come to retirement age, you can't ring fence that bit. I don't know, I feel like it's a little bit complicated.
Actually, they do in France have different retirement ages. So public services, the police, for example. And actually, I think the most recent change in the law does not apply to them. But if you ask me, I think let's talk about not just public sector, but private sector. Let's say those that do a trade. They do such a physical job that I think, but then most of them are self-employed. Let's say those that are employed. I think they should be allowed to retire earlier because they do such a physical job, How can they do it when they're over 65, even 60? Now, office workers, I'm in between two minds because it's not physical, but like you say, Rameez, it's the mental aspect. And it is actually exhausting, when you do a job that is demanding, nervously. I think it is exhausting. And I don't know if people should be working until 70 67, 68, 70. But I do think those that do a physical job, they should be allowed to retire earlier.
So when you talk about office workers, I think, yes, some jobs can be very stressful, but don't you have more of a choice? Because if you have a job that is maybe mentally stressful, you can try and go find a job that maybe is a better environment, less stressful. Whereas if you are in a particular profession, actually the role is very similar, it's very physically demanding, and you don't really have a choice.
I suppose that this ties in with, all the huge inflation we've been experiencing, the cost of living. Maybe people would like to change, but they feel they can't. Because usually, with more responsibilities, you would have more stress, and yes, you would be earning more, but maybe people feel they don't have that choice. But you're right in the sense that the option is still there. But it's thinking about what can they do to then reduce their outgoings.
Well, let's think about inflation then. So one of the reasons, well, probably the main reason the strikes have been taking place in the UK is because the unions have all been fighting for higher pay increases. In some cases, inflationary pay increases. Inflation is at record levels, up to 12%. And is it reasonable for unions to be demanding inflationary pay increases in the public sector or in some of these other jobs when we know, because we recently published our Pulse survey, and we know that the median in the private sector is 5%, and it might fluctuate slightly by industry or sector, but that's roughly where it stays. So is it reasonable to demand inflationary pay increases?
As a high-level statement, I think no, because of the things that you said. We've seen that that's not what's taking place in the private sector, and it has to come down to affordability. But when you take each industry or each sector that's striking in its own case and actually look into each one, there might be actual arguments for what they are striking for or their inflationary increase, because you need to look at the context of what increases have they had over the last 5 years, 6 years, 10 years, even since the last recession. In the public sector, there was a lot of rules on capping increases. So it's only in the last few years they started to get something around 1%, 2%. And also, which parts of those sectors are they targeting? So if it's the lowest paid, you've got to bear in mind minimum wage has gone up by 10%. So all those people who were just above minimum wage payments, there's just no difference between what they're getting paid now and minimum wage unless you start to increase their salaries as well. So I think that is pushing a bit of that narrative as well of wanting these inflationary increases for certain sectors. Obviously that doesn't work for something like a train driver who's already quite far above a minimum wage. So that's why I say you need to look at each case by case basis, I think.
I think it's a tough call because I think it's the perception of the employees that if they don't get an increase that matches the inflation rate, then they feel it's a pay cut. Just like we've seen in the article of, I can't remember which union now. And I think that's what you said, Tracey, is about affordability. So I don't know if there's something that needs to be done here about perception and just communicating that it's all down to affordability. And I will say something that will not make me very popular, but in the public sector, they also need to think that actually who pays for their salaries? This is paid by the taxpayers from the private sector and probably the government borrowing money as well. So, and the other thing that I think is that in the public sector, I do think they've got benefits, good benefits, unless it's changed, but usually earlier retirement age, maybe more annual leave, sick pay, no performance management sometimes, so perhaps a little bit less stressful. So I think for me it's also, again, the communication around the total package, perhaps, that people might be getting in the public sector. And then, Tracey, like you said, with the private sector is really difficult because it's also affordability. And we know that salaries are the biggest cost for any company. And if they want to increase salaries, they need to be sure that they can recoup the money. So they will have to pass on the costs to their clients. Their clients might be okay with it. They might not be okay. So they will stop buying, products or services. Plus, in the private sector, they would have shareholders most of the time. So also they need a return on investment here. So this is very difficult. And overall, what I want to say is that I think we need to look at the bigger picture and perhaps not fall into the trap that perhaps I fall into myself, that it's public sector versus private sector. I think we're all in this together. We should really be together. And ultimately, and I sound very political, I think it's the government that should really be doing something about all of this. But I think, Rameez, you probably had a question around solutions at some point, which I have a few ideas about what the government should do. And it's stepping in when they need to, with the cost of living in terms of energy prices, the groceries and so on, that I think has gone out of control and that they could do something about it. So, there are two things. If we can't increase salaries, could we look at reducing outgoings for people?
I do have a question on something you just said, which is that we need to think about who's paying the salaries in the public sector, which is the taxpayers. And so does that mean that they should have stricter controls over pay, or should the treatment of pay be fair in the public sector and it should be fair in the private sector? Because I think we sometimes have this for charities as well, because there's an obsession sometimes people have with charities need to spend as little as possible on salaries and admin costs, and everything needs to go towards the actual cause. But how do people who work in these sectors get paid? Because if we want to attract good people and good talent into these sectors so they're able to make long-term impact, we need to pay the right salaries, even though it is the charity sector. So I think the same argument can be applied to the public sector. So are you saying that there should be lower pay increases just because taxpayers are paying those salaries?
I don't think they should have lower pay increases for that reason. I think everyone should be paid a fair market rate. That's what it should be. And I think in the past, where you're able to compare a public sector role with a private sector role, I don't know that they've necessarily been paid less, to be honest. But I think what has happened, like I said, in recent years, we've had this Conservative government for quite a long time now, and I'm not saying that that's the total reason, but ever since we had sort of the recession, I think 2010, something around then, the public sector pay has had a lot of restriction on it and a lot of cap on it. So it would be interesting to see now, if you compared a like-for-like role, what's the difference in the pay.
I think, Tracey, you have a really good point, because we do have similar jobs in the public and private sector, you're right. And I think also, thinking about the public sector, and I think, Rameez, you had mentioned this before, obviously not in this podcast, but before, we've got jobs that, and I don't know how to express this, but add a lot of value. And we're thinking about, for example, nurses. They do a really difficult job. Their pay is not the greatest. So it's almost like, how do we define what is a fair pay? Because the value they bring is huge. But at the same time, I do think, because it's funded by the taxpayers, I'm really sorry to say it, but I think it should be fair, but it should still be really looked at. And I don't want to use that word, but almost tightened, have a tightened purse. But it's really difficult. It's the value of the role. And I have to say, I do not know why I think their pay is low when we think about nurses, for example. And I don't know why it's been that way.
Well, I think yeah, I've probably got some opinions, but they might not be based in fact. But I think historically, nursing is female dominated. In the past, years and years ago, you could go straight into nursing. Now you go to university and you get a degree. It should be treated as any other, degree, professional type role. It's just that has the pay cut up with that. The other thing is actually fully qualified starting, a nurse fully qualified, I think is something like 28k starting salary. So actually not that bad. But what happens is even after like 5 years, you can't get past 34 and a half. So it's okay to start with, and then there's just no pay progression unless you're willing to go up to the next level and specialise in something, or become a matron, or become a people manager. So it's that restriction on the progression that doesn't acknowledge the extra contribution that nurses that have been there for 10 years are bringing.
Yeah. So interestingly, this was discussed in episode 2 of A Case of the Mondays. And it's a good thing you mentioned the same number that I mentioned, which is 28,000. And so I think there is that, because we were discussing, how does society decide the value of different types of jobs? Because just like nursing, teaching jobs are underpaid. And I was saying how I used to teach on Saturdays, and that one day was more draining than my Monday to Friday, because it's such a tough job. But if you look at teaching, you look at nursing, and then you look at something like train drivers, right? And you could be a fully qualified train driver and you could be on a salary of 65 to 70,000. And I think this is the challenge with the obsession with inflationary pay increases that unions have, is if you have one job that you feel is undervalued, underpaid, and another job, I don't want to annoy people and say overpaid, but maybe it's overvalued compared to nursing or teaching, then it's not fair to give everyone an inflationary pay increase. And going back to, yes, it's taxpayers' money, so there's a single fund where all of this comes from, and maybe we need to reallocate some of this so, there's a lower increase for the train drivers and a lot more goes towards some of these other professions. But I think it's just very difficult because in the UK, at least, there is a real obsession with everyone needs to maintain their living standards and have an inflationary pay increase. And until we recognise that actually there's so much inequality, the inequality in the UK is one of the highest in Europe. Income inequality, the wealth inequality is even higher. But until you recognise that there's so much inequality, and then we can't just keep, because all we're doing is maintaining that inequality, right? Or in fact, we're increasing it, because a 12% increase at 75,000 is a lot more than a 12% increase at 28,000. So we're just increasing that inequality without really addressing the root cause.
Some of the media doesn't help as well, because it will say BT workers were successful in, I can't remember what it was it something like 12% pay increase? So that makes everybody think, oh God, everybody's getting 12%. But actually, that was just targeted on employees below 50k, which is great. And actually, it was everybody got a flat sum. So for some, that was a 6% increase. For some, it was a 16% increase. And the headline figure is just the average of that. But again, it was for those that are under 50k. But then people who were reading that in the news, and their companies just giving them the 5% or 3% or less than that, they're thinking, oh, this isn't fair, everybody else is getting this. But actually, it's not true. And that's why we have to look beyond these numbers.
What is the solution? I guess, it's highlighting the fact that we need to move away from thinking about inflation on its own when we talk about pay increases. And maybe, yes, inflation is maybe more critical for people below a particular salary, because there's also not everyone is spending their income on the same thing. Should we just stop talking about the same increase for everyone and say, if you're up to a particular salary, you need an inflationary pay increase, and if you're above this salary, then it should be a 3% increase?
I think it's tricky because it makes me think about the one-off cost of living payments that, some companies chose to make this year, the past couple of years. And, when we look at surveys, I think most of them determine who should receive what based on the salary. So they assess that those on lower salaries should receive something. And I think from what I heard, you did have complaints from people who were earning more because they said, oh, but we're all impacted by it. And the fact that someone who earns more would also be paying more tax. So in the end, do they have more disposable income or not? I don't know. If we think about solutions, I think I touched upon a couple of things. First, and sorry, it's not going to be popular, but if we think about the public sector, I do think they tend to have better benefits than those in the private sector. I might be wrong, but perhaps, recommunicating on this, if it's not always possible to give them the best pay increases. I think the other thing is that I do think the government should be stepping in and sometimes really cap, the prices of some, utilities. And I think I was just thinking about something else I think the UK, just like France, is a very centralized country, and a lot of the jobs are in the capital city, and it's so expensive. And perhaps, and it's a long-term policy, of course, if we were to have a more decentralized country where jobs could be found elsewhere with a lower cost of living, that could help people, they could think, okay, I want to move there. Because for me, the thing is that you can't increase salaries, we need to decrease the outgoings. And I do think the government has got a role to play in this.
I guess some of that will happen with remote working. So, I can't remember the exact numbers, Tracey, but in the recent survey, there was it something like 40% of people have the option to work completely remotely? And so is that going to allow more mobility?
I guess, obviously, we weren't just asking public sector. So I think what Sophie referring to there is the number of civil service jobs that are based in London. I mean, I actually saw someone who was striking for civil service, and they were saying that 1 in 8 in the civil service are having to use a food bank. Graduates, to get into the civil service, often have to go to London to get anywhere, to get going with their graduate scheme, but they're not really being paid enough to move to London. It's not just, these strikes aren't just about pay, they are about working conditions, and there are things that can be done about working conditions that would really, really help these strike scenarios.
And I don't know, is there a cap on the number of places open, to new nurses? Or I think I heard something like this. I don't know if it's true.
No, there isn't a cap. I mean, they're really struggling to recruit nurses at the moment. There's tens of thousands of vacancies. They're struggling to recruit, and it's it's a mix of the impact of Brexit and the working conditions, because lack of pay, all of these reasons. If you going back to that train example, you have one application for a train driver, and you literally have thousands of applications for that one position because there's so much competition. And why wouldn't there be? You come out of university, within 12, 18 months, you can earn £65,000. And it's not just about pay, but I think it does have an impact when you are at that stage early on in your career. You're looking at all the different professions. What is the starting salary? So I think when you see the number of vacancies you have within nursing, you see the oversubscription of applications in rail, then there clearly is an inequality, and I think that's an area where, Sophie, you're talking about the government coming in, and I think there really needs to be a review, because it's a bit like, Tracey, you're getting paid £100 for something, and Sophie, you're getting 1,000, and then we say, oh, let's just give an inflationary increase to both people without having a conversation around, well, what about the inequality and the unfairness to start off with? How do we address that issue? Everyone's just thinking, I just want to maintain my cost of living, but actually you're being unfairly treated. And I think that's where the government needs to come in. So with the rise of AI, most people that we know are talking about ChatGPT, either using it or talking about it. And there's a lot of discussion around how we're going to see a massive loss of jobs with AI doing a lot of the things that people are doing now. So do you think there's going to be a big rise in strikes, even, further strikes?
I want to quote the article from the World Economic Forum. In the next 5 years, so I'm going to read, 44% of workers' core skills are expected to change. So this means 44%, not of workers, but the skills would need some sort of retraining or reskilling. I often think that the jobs that will disappear are those that are unskilled, but it's not just those jobs. I looked at the list, and for example, and I'm sorry, I don't want to scare anyone with this, but I can see accountants on it. This is a qualified job, hey, and they are saying to us, this job might disappear within the next 5 years. So I think, to answer your question, now that I remember what your question was, I think strikes will, increase. And this is not just public now, this is private sector, because we often hear, in the media that people struggle with the cost of living already. They struggle to make ends meet. So if on top of that, they now think, I'm going to lose my job, what is there left? It's all about hope. There's no hope left. And I think it's when people reach the stage where there's no hope left and they've had enough that they are going on strike and they are going to protest.
Well, you, all through this podcast, Sophie, you've been like, right, the government need to look at the cost of outgoings and look at where they could be saving money. So AI is going to save money. So I don't know if we can really strike against that, because the government's always saying, or councils are always saying, we've not got enough money for this, we've not got enough money for that. So if they can save money through AI, they've got to take that opportunity.
Companies will embrace it because for them it's cost saving, but there needs to be a plan in place, like you said, to reskill people, retrain them. Because I think if suddenly you've got a lot of people who are going to be unemployed, I think there's going to be civil unrest.
That is possible, because I think the loss of some jobs is inevitable, and I think there will be strikes. And then I think a good example is if you look at rail, and when we shifted from having lots of people sitting in ticket offices to having the machines, a lot of those people weren't needed, and there was a big dispute and lots of strikes taking place to say, we don't want to lose these jobs. People need to speak to somebody. And so maybe it will delay the whole process by a couple of years, but I'm sure that there will be strikes in the public sector. But whose responsibility is it to upskill and learn about AI? Because, I think we have to accept that most people are not going to be proactive and start to explore, maybe I'm going to lose my job in 5 years or 3 years. I need to start learning how to use this. And then at the same time, we also can't just say everything is the government's responsibility. I think in the private sector, actually, it's the companies will take less responsibility because they're just going to think, we can cut these costs. And so we're just going to introduce... although I think, in the private sector, there are two ways to think about this. One way is this is going to lead to a loss of jobs and it's going to save us costs. The other way to think about it is, which is how we think about it, is this is going to make us 5 times more productive, right? And so in the private sector, I think that's the mindset. But in the public sector, they know that you can't just make a decision because it will lead to a strike. And so in the public sector, there is more of a whether it's a moral responsibility or a legal responsibility for them to do something?
There's got to be a point where there is a human interjection in some of that process. So whether it's the development of the software, using the software, checking it, there must be a human role in some of that. So it's about those that are in the jobs being prepared for how the future is going to look and making sure that those roles are being reskilled so that they can use these tools in the future.
Okay. Thanks, Tracey. Thanks, Sophie. That was a really interesting conversation. It's great to find out more about what's happening in France and why some of these workers are striking. And although the reasons why they're striking is different from here in the UK, I think we're sort of agreeing that we're going to continue to see more strikes in the future for a number of issues, and AI being one of them. But like you said, AI is a big topic, and probably one we will discuss in a future episode of A Case of the Mondays. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.